man called me disgusting for breastfeeding my baby at a family restaurant and told me to feed her in the bathroom. So my mother-in-law stood up and made him regret. My daughter Louisa was 4 months old the first time someone told me I was doing something disgusting by feeding her. I want to be clear about what I was doing. I was sitting in a booth at a family restaurant at 11:30 on a Saturday morning with a nursing cover draped over my shoulder, feeding my infant daughter because she was hungry, and that is what babies do. They get hungry and you feed them. My husband Gio was next to me, his mother, my mother-in-law Raquel, across from us. We were at a place called Rosario's, a casual spot with checkered tablecloths and a kids menu and crayons at the host stand. This was not a bar. This was not a nightclub. This was the kind of place where people bring toddlers and order chicken fingers and nobody thinks twice about it. Louisa started fussing about 10 minutes after we sat down. I knew she was hungry because I'm her mother, and I know what her hungry cry sounds like. I put my cover on, got her latched, and continued looking at the menu with one hand. Gio was talking to Raquel about replacing the gutters on her house. It was the most boring, normal lunch you could imagine. Then the man at the next table tapped the edge of ours with 2 fingers like he was knocking on a door. He was maybe 50, sitting with his wife and another couple. 4 adults, no children. He said, "Excuse me." I looked up. He said, "I don't think you should be doing that here." I said, "Doing what?" He pointed at the cover and said, "Feeding it like that. Here, where people are trying to eat." I said, "She's a baby. She's eating too." He said, "There are bathrooms for that." His wife nodded. I told him I wasn't going to feed my daughter in a bathroom. He said, "Then you should have brought a bottle." I said, "Nothing is showing." He said, "It doesn't matter. Everyone knows what's happening under there, and he shouldn't have to explain to his friends what some woman is doing with her chest out at the next table." Gio put his menu down and told him to mind his own business. The man said he was minding his business until I made it his business by doing something sexual in a public restaurant. He used that word, sexual, about me feeding my 4-month-old. He said it loud enough that the table on the other side of us looked over. He said what I was doing was inappropriate, and that I should think about what kind of message I was sending by putting my body on display in front of strangers. My body was not on display. I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans and a nursing cover that went from my collarbone to my waist. You could not see a single inch of skin. But this man decided that the knowledge of what was happening under the cover was enough to offend him. His wife leaned in and said maybe I could finish in the car. She said it in a sweet voice like she was offering helpful advice. She said it would just be easier for everyone. Easier for everyone. My baby was eating. The only people with a problem were the 4 adults at the next table who could not stop staring at a piece of fabric draped over my shoulder. Raquel had been sitting quietly the whole time, reading glasses on the table, hands folded. Then she stood up. She picked up her glass of water, walked the 2 steps to the man's table, and set it down in front of him. She said I breastfed 3 sons. In restaurants, in parks, on buses, in church pews. Not one person who watched me was harmed by it. She said if you think a mother feeding her baby is sexual, that says something about you that I'd be embarrassed to admit in front of my friends. The man told her to go back to her table. Raquel didn't move. She said if you say one more word to her, I will ask the manager to come over and you can explain why a covered mother feeding an infant is ruining your lunch. The man's wife said they didn't need to involve management. Raquel said then stop talking to us. She picked up her water, walked back, and sat down. She opened her menu and said she was thinking about the grilled fish. About 20 minutes later, our waiter came over and said another guest had complained to the front and the manager was on her way. The manager came over a minute later, mid-30s, black polo, the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. She said she just wanted to make sure everyone was comfortable. Every table within earshot had gone quiet. Gio didn't let a full second pass. He looked right at her and said, "She's feeding our daughter. There's nothing to be comfortable or uncomfortable about." The manager said she personally had no issue, but another guest had raised a concern and she had to follow up. Raquel set her menu down flat. She asked, "Does this restaurant have a policy against breastfeeding?" The manager blinked. She said no. Raquel said then there's nothing to follow up on. Tell the man who complained that the law is on our side and so is your own policy. The manager nodded and turned toward Gustavo's table. Before she even got there, Gustavo pushed himself halfway out of his chair, loud enough for the whole room. He said, "So you're just going to let her sit there and do that? This is a family restaurant." His wife Becca reached over and put her hand on his arm. He jerked his arm away like her touch was something to shake off. Becca's hand dropped to the table. She didn't try again. The manager stopped in front of him and told him breastfeeding was protected by law and asked him to lower his voice. He said, "I'm not going to lower my voice. Are you telling me my comfort doesn't matter?" She said she was sorry he was uncomfortable, but the mother was not doing anything wrong. He sat back down hard. He muttered something to the couple across from him. The man across from him, his friend, didn't say anything back. He just looked at his wife and they shared a look that said, "This is bad and we should not be part of it." Becca was staring at the table like if she looked hard enough at the wood grain she could disappear into it, hands in her lap, shoulders pulled in, the careful, practiced way of making yourself as small as possible so the person next to you doesn't get any louder. A few minutes went by. Louisa pulled off on her own and gave that satisfied little grunt, and I lifted her to my shoulder and burped her. I folded up the cover and put it in the diaper bag. Done. Then I heard Gustavo's voice. He was leaning toward his friend across the table, but he wasn't trying to be quiet. He said, "This is what's wrong with this generation. No shame. No consideration for anyone else." Raquel's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. I put my hand on her arm. I said, "It's okay. He's not worth it." She said, "He's not talking to us. He's performing for his friends. Let him perform." And she picked her fork back up. I thought that was going to be the end of it. I really thought he was just going to mutter and grumble and eventually pay his check and leave, and we'd never have to think about him again. But Gustavo was not the kind of man who hears you're wrong and accepts it. He wasn't embarrassed. He was loading up for round 2. Then his friend spoke. The other man at the table, the one who had been silent the whole time. He said honestly, "I don't see what the big deal was. The baby was hungry." The words just hung there. Gustavo turned to him like he'd been slapped. He said, "Are you serious right now?" The friend said, "You made a scene, Gus. The manager already told you it was fine." Gus. They knew each other. Gustavo said, "So I'm the bad guy for not wanting to see that while I'm eating." His friend said, "You didn't see anything. She had a cover on." 6 words, every one of them true. Gustavo opened his mouth and nothing came out. I watched Becca through all of this and felt something I didn't expect. Pity, not for him, for her. She hadn't said a single word since the manager came over. When he jerked his arm away from her earlier, she didn't flinch, and that was the part that got me. She didn't flinch because she wasn't surprised. I leaned close to Gio and whispered, "Look at his wife." Gio looked. His face softened into something sadder. He turned back to me and said, "Yeah, I see it." We'd both seen that kind of silence before. The kind that isn't peaceful, it's practiced. Part of me, a part I didn't want to admit was already thinking about what would have happened if Raquel hadn't been with us. If it had just been me and Gio. Would I have gone to the car? Would I have picked up the diaper bag and walked away with my head down just to avoid this exact situation? I hated that the answer might be yes. I hated that a man I'd never met before had the power to make me feel like I was the one who needed to leave. Then Gustavo stood up from his table and walked toward the back, toward the bathrooms. He disappeared around the corner. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. A minute passed. Then I saw him coming back. He was walking up the aisle and I expected him to turn right and sit at his own table. He didn't. He stopped right at the edge of our table, next to me. He didn't look at Gio or Raquel. He looked directly at me. He said, "I hope you're happy with yourself. I hope when your daughter grows up, she has more class than her mother." My chest went so tight I couldn't breathe for a second. He had walked past a bathroom, washed his hands, looked at himself in the mirror, and on the walk back decided he still hadn't done enough damage. He needed to come to my table, stand over me, and insult me as a mother. Gio was already pushing up from the booth, jaw set. Raquel reached across the table and put her hand flat on his arm, firm. She pressed down and said one word, "No." Gio stopped. She let go of his arm, and she stood up. She didn't walk over this time. She stood right where she was and faced him from 4 feet away. She said, "You just walked over to a woman holding a sleeping baby to insult her parenting. Do you hear yourself?" Gustavo's chin lifted. He said, "I'm stating a fact." Raquel said, "No. You're a grown man who has been told by a manager, by your own friend, and by your own wife's silence that you are wrong. And instead of sitting down and eating your lunch, you walked over here to try to make a new mother feel small. That is not a fact. That is a choice. And it is a pathetic one." She said the word pathetic the way you put a period at the end of a sentence. Final, closed, done. The restaurant went quiet. A woman 2 booths over said loud enough to carry, "She's right. Leave them alone." Then a man's voice from behind us said seriously, "Dude, 2 strangers." Gustavo's head turned, scanning, looking for anyone on his side. I watched his eyes move from table to table and watched what happened to his face when he couldn't find what he was looking for. The confidence didn't fade. It cracked. Then something happened that nobody at our table expected. Becca stood up. She pushed her chair back and she stood up, and everybody watching expected her to walk over and collect her husband. That's not what happened. She looked past Gustavo. She looked directly at Raquel, and in a voice so thin it sounded like it might snap in half, she said, "I'm sorry. I should have said something sooner. I should have said something a long time ago." The way she said a long time ago told me everything. This was not about today. This was about years. Gustavo spun around to face her. His face had gone from cracked to something scared. He said, "Sit down," like a command, like a man who was used to saying those 2 words and having them obeyed. Becca didn't sit down. She reached behind her chair and picked up her purse. She put the strap over her shoulder slowly, carefully, like every movement was a decision she was making for the first time. He said, "Becca, sit down." She didn't look at him. She turned and walked toward the front of the restaurant. Not fast, not slow, like a woman who had finally remembered her legs worked. The other woman from his table grabbed her purse and followed Becca toward the door. Gustavo stood in the aisle between our tables like a man watching his house catch fire. Then he turned back to us. His face was deep blotchy red. His hands were shaking at his sides. He said, "You did this. You people did this." Gio stood up all the way this time. He said, "You need to walk away right now." Gustavo took half a step closer. He said, "Your wife caused a scene and now my wife just walked out. Are you proud of yourselves?" Gio said, "Your wife walked out because of you, not us. You." The manager appeared again, walking fast, and this time she wasn't alone. There was a man with her, older, buttoned down with sleeves rolled up, no name tag, but the kind of authority that doesn't need one. The manager stopped a few feet from Gustavo. No polite smile this time. She said, "Sir, I'm going to need you to return to your table or I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Gustavo pointed at us. He said, "I want them asked to leave. They started this." The manager said, "That is not what happened and you know it." Then Gustavo's friend stood up and walked into the aisle and put a hand on his shoulder, a gentle hand, a friend's hand. He said, "Come on, man. This is enough. Let's just go." Gustavo shrugged it off, hard. He said, "Don't touch me. Everyone in this place is acting like I'm the bad guy, and all I did was ask a woman to be considerate." His friend stood there for a second, his face hardening. He said quietly, "You called her disgusting, Gus, in front of her husband and her mother. What did you think was going to happen?" That word, disgusting, the word Gustavo had used at the very beginning, now in his friend's mouth, aimed back at him, not as an insult, but as a mirror. Gustavo opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. Nothing came out. His eyes moved across the room. A father 2 tables over holding a toddler on his hip, looking at Gustavo and shaking his head. Slow and steady, the way you shake your head at something you can't believe you're watching. A teenage girl by the window watching with wide eyes, her phone in her hand but not raised up to record, just sitting in her hand like she'd picked it up out of habit. The kind of wide eyes that said she was going to remember this lunch for a very long time. Not a single person in that restaurant was on his side. Not one. Not the father with the toddler. Not the teenage girl. Not the couple by the window. Not his own friend who was standing right behind him. Not his wife who had walked out the door. The entire room had made its decision, and the decision was unanimous, and it was not in his favor. His face did this thing where every muscle seemed to go slack at once, like a puppet whose strings got cut. Then I did something I hadn't done since this started. I stood up. I picked Luisa up from her car seat and held her against my chest with one hand supporting her head. She didn't wake. I had not spoken directly to Gustavo since those first few exchanges. Since then, Gio had spoken for me, Raquel had spoken for me, the manager had spoken for me, strangers had spoken for me, but this part was mine. I looked at him. He was already looking at me because I was standing and holding my baby, and some part of him knew what was coming. I said I was feeding my baby. That's all I was doing. You turned it into something it never was, and now your wife is gone. Your friend is telling you that you were wrong, and a room full of strangers thinks less of you. I didn't do any of that to you. You did all of it to yourself. My voice didn't shake. Every word came out clear. Gustavo stared at me. His eyes moved to Luisa, asleep on my chest, chest. Her tiny fingers curled against my collarbone, then back to mine, and he had nothing. No comeback, just silence. His friend stepped forward again and took his arm, gently but firmly, and this time Gustavo didn't shrug him off. He let himself be turned. He let himself be walked back to his table. He sat down, and his hands went flat in front of him, and he didn't look up again. Gustavo's friend got up from the table a few minutes later. He walked over to us by himself and stopped at the edge of our booth and didn't sit down. He just stood there looking at each of us. He said, "I want to apologize on his behalf, but honestly, I want to apologize for myself too. I sat there when he first said it and I didn't say anything. That was wrong." He looked right at me when he said it, then at Raquel. This wasn't a man trying to smooth things over so everyone could pretend lunch was fine. This was a man who had been sitting with the weight of his own silence and couldn't carry it to the parking lot. Raquel didn't smile and didn't soften and didn't tell him it was okay, because Raquel doesn't say things she doesn't mean. But she nodded. She said it was. "But you said something eventually. That matters." He nodded back and walked back to his table. A few minutes later, the manager came back. She said, "Your meal is on the house today." Gio started to say something, but she held up her hand and said, "Not because of what happened. Because no mother should have to defend feeding her child in our restaurant, and I'm sorry it happened here." She placed her business card on the table and said to ask for her by name next time. Raquel told her, "You did the right thing today." That took backbone. We started getting ready to leave. Raquel packed up the diaper bag, efficient as always. Gio lifted Luisa's car seat off the booth. I was sliding out and reaching for my purse when I looked toward the front of the restaurant, and I stopped. Becca was standing just inside the front door. She hadn't left. She was standing there near the host stand, her purse on her shoulder, her hands clasped in front of her. She was waiting for us. As we walked toward the front, Becca stepped forward, like someone who had been building up the courage to do something, and was scared she might lose it if she waited longer. She stopped in front of me, looked at my face, looked at Luisa in the car seat on Gio's arm, then back at me. She said, "I need to tell you something." I said, "Okay." She said, "When I had my daughter, he told me the same thing. He told me it was disgusting. He told me to go to another room." She paused and swallowed hard. She said, and I did. Every single time I went to another room because he made me feel like I was doing something wrong. She's 23 now, and I still think about it. Her voice broke on that last part. It cracked right down the middle like a piece of wood that had been bending for too long, and I could hear in that crack every single time she had picked up her baby and walked into a bedroom and closed the door because the man she married told her she should be ashamed of feeding her child. 23 years. Her daughter was 23 years old, and Becca was still carrying this. She looked at me with wet eyes and said, "I should have said what you said. I should have stayed in my seat." I felt like I was looking at a version of myself that almost happened. A version where Raquel wasn't there. A version where Gio didn't speak up. A version where I took the baby to the car like Becca suggested, and spent the rest of my life wondering why I let a stranger decide where I was allowed to feed my daughter. I could have been her. If the people around me had been different, if I hadn't had Raquel and Gio and even the strangers in that restaurant who spoke up, I could have been exactly where Becca was standing right now. 23 years later, still thinking about it. I said, "You stood up today. You walked away from that table in front of everyone. That counts." Becca shook her head. She said, "That's the first time I've ever done that." Her voice was so small. Raquel stepped forward. She didn't say anything at first. She just reached out and took Becca's hand, held it the way you hold something that might break if you squeeze too hard. Then Raquel said, "Then it's a good day." 4 words. No lecture, no big moment. Just a quiet truth from one woman to another. Becca nodded. She wiped her eyes with the back of her free hand. She looked at Luisa one more time and said, "Your daughter is beautiful. Don't ever let anyone make you feel bad for taking care of her." Then she let go of Raquel's hand and turned and walked toward the parking lot. She pushed through the front door and the sunlight hit her, and she walked out into it without stopping and without turning around. Gustavo was still inside. Becca didn't look back. We walked to the car. Gio strapped Luisa's car seat into the base. Raquel got in the passenger seat and put her sunglasses on. I sat in the driver's seat and put the key in the ignition but didn't turn it. I adjusted the rearview mirror until I could see Luisa, asleep. That full, satisfied sleep after a good meal. Milk drunk and peaceful. She had no idea. She just knew she was hungry, and then she wasn't, and that was enough for her. I stared at her and felt my eyes burn. Raquel turned to me and said, "You okay?" I said, "Yeah, I think I am." I turned the key and the engine started. I said, "Raquel, thank you for everything you said in there." Raquel adjusted her sunglasses and looked straight ahead through the windshield. She said I didn't say anything that wasn't true. That's the easiest kind of thing to say. I pulled out of the parking lot. In the side mirror, I could see the restaurant getting smaller. Just a building with a sign and checkered tablecloths inside. But also inside it right now, a man was sitting at a table with one friend. No wife, no second couple. Just one friend who had already told him he was wrong, and a room full of people who watched him become exactly the thing he accused someone else of being. Someone with no class, no shame, and no consideration for anyone but himself. Luisa slept the whole ride home.